You don't wake up poor overnight. It happens quietly. And you don't even notice it happening. Most people believe ancient economies were simple. Farmers worked. People traded. Life was basic. That belief is comforting and completely wrong. In the time of Jesus, the economy wasn't simple at all. It was engineered. Roman-controlled Judea ran on a system designed to do one thing extremely well: move wealth upward, away from ordinary people. The pattern never changed. You worked, you produced, you paid. And the moment something went wrong, the system stopped caring about effort. Here's what most people don't realize. Farmers didn't pay taxes with crops. They paid in silver. That single rule changed everything. It forced people to sell their harvest early, often cheap, just to get the money required. If prices dropped, tough luck. If the harvest failed, didn't matter. The bill stayed the same. Missed one payment, and it wasn't a warning. It was debt. And debt back then wasn't temporary. Interest was brutal. Deadlines were fixed. One bad season could cost you your land, another could cost you your freedom. Families didn't just fall behind, they disappeared into dependency. But here's the most important part. The reason this system worked so well: people didn't see it as a system. They blamed themselves. They believed if they worked harder, planned better, prayed more, things would improve. That belief protected the machine. Because when people blamed themselves, they never questioned the structure trapping them. Rome didn't rule by violence alone. It ruled by structure. Taxes, rents, fees, and penalties were layered on top of each other. Every layer made survival harder and escape nearly impossible. Wealth moved upward, step by step, while risk stayed at the bottom. This wasn't accidental, it was policy. Rome understood something important. If people depend on the system to survive, they will protect it themselves. They will blame themselves instead of questioning the rules. Most people were too busy surviving to notice what was happening. And that's why the system lasted. You might think this story belongs to the past. It doesn't. The tools look different now. The language has changed. But the structure is familiar. Back then, people didn't realize they were inside a machine until they could no longer get out. By the time they understood it, the system had already won. Debt in the ancient world wasn't just about money. It was about power. In Roman Judea, debt decided who had choices and who didn't. Once a family fell behind, everything changed. You didn't just owe money, you owed obedience. Most loans weren't taken for luxury. They were taken to survive. A failed harvest, a new tax, or a sick family member was enough. Borrowing felt temporary. It never was. Interest kept running. Penalties stacked up. And because taxes had fixed deadlines, lenders always had leverage. They knew borrowers were desperate. When people couldn't repay, land was the first thing taken. That land didn't disappear. It moved upward into the hands of elites connected to Roman authority. Former owners stayed, but now as tenants on land they once owned, this is where control became permanent. Tenant farmers had no flexibility. They owed rent, taxes, and interest at the same time. Missing one payment triggered another penalty. There was no reset, no second chance. And if land wasn't enough, labor was next. Debt labor was legal and common. People worked not to build wealth, but to stay alive. Families could be split. Children could be bound to creditors. The system didn't care. It was designed to function, not to forgive. What made the system effective was that it looked normal. There was no single villain walking around collecting everything. Instead, there were contracts, courts, and officials. Everything had a legal explanation. That made resistance feel pointless. People blamed fate, or God, or themselves. Rome didn't need to monitor everyone. The system disciplined people automatically. The more you owed, the quieter you became. And this is where another layer appears. Religion and authority reinforced the structure. Local elites benefited from stability, so they supported the system. Order mattered more than fairness. Anyone who challenged the arrangement was seen as dangerous. Not because they were violent, but because they threatened predictability. And predictable systems are extremely profitable. You think this is ancient history, but notice the pattern. Fixed obligations, rising costs, no margin for error, punishment for falling behind. The system doesn't have to hate you, it only has to be inflexible. Once you depend on it to survive, resistance becomes risky. Silence becomes rational. That's how debt stops being a financial issue and turns into control. And once control is normalized, the system doesn't need force anymore. People enforce it on themselves. Taxes in Roman times weren't just high. They were designed to break people. Rome didn't collect taxes directly from everyone. It outsourced the job. Tax collectors paid Rome up front, then squeezed as much as possible from the population to make profit. That single incentive changed everything. Once a collector had paid Rome, every extra coin taken from people was pure gain. There was no upper limit, no protection. Complaints went nowhere because the system was working as intended. Taxes weren't flexible. They were due on time, every time. Bad harvest? Not Rome's problem. Drought? Still pay. Illness? Still pay. Miss a payment and penalties kicked in immediately. This is where debt and taxes merged into one trap. To pay taxes, people borrowed. To repay loans, they needed good harvests. When harvests failed, land was seized. When land was gone, people rented it back. When rent couldn't be paid, labor was demanded. Rome didn't need soldiers in every village. Taxes did the job. Fear did the rest. And here's the key detail most people miss. Taxes were demanded in coin, not goods. That sounds small. It wasn't. Most rural families lived in a barter economy. They grew food. They traded locally. Coins were scarce. To get coins, people had to sell crops early at bad prices or borrow at high interest. That forced them into markets controlled by elites. It was artificial dependence. Rome created demand for money, then controlled access to it. Once people needed coins to survive, whoever controlled money controlled life. You see the pattern forming. First, fixed taxes. Then, forced borrowing. Then, loss of land. Then, permanent dependency. And the worst part, it felt legal, official, and normal. People didn't rise up because the system punished individuals, not crowds, one family at a time, one debt at a time. Everyone thought their situation was personal failure. That's how systems survive. They isolate pain. By the time people realized it wasn't just them, they had nothing left to resist with. And Rome framed this as order, stability, civilization. Chaos was the enemy. Questioning the system meant threatening peace. So people complied, not because they agreed, because they were cornered. This is the moment where a system stops being economic and becomes psychological. Once survival depends on obedience, freedom becomes theoretical. And the system doesn't need to explain itself anymore. It just keeps running. Here's where the system became unbeatable. Rome didn't just control money, it controlled meaning. By the time of Jesus, poverty wasn't treated as a failure of the system. It was treated as a failure of the person. If you were poor, the assumption was simple: you mismanaged. You sinned. You deserved it. That belief didn't come from nowhere. It was useful, because once people believed their suffering is their own fault, they stopped questioning the structure that caused it. Debt became moral. Wealth became proof of virtue. Landowners were seen as successful, disciplined, favored. The poor were seen as irresponsible, lazy, broken. This wasn't accidental. It stabilized the system. Think about how powerful that is. If hunger feels like shame, you won't rebel. If debt feels like guilt, you'll comply. If poverty feels deserved, you'll endure it silently. Rome didn't need to silence people. People silenced themselves. And the system rewarded obedience. Pay your taxes, respect authority, don't cause trouble. Maybe next year will be better. It rarely was. What made this worse was how slow the damage happened. Land wasn't taken overnight. Debt didn't crush you in 1 month. Loss came in small pieces, a little interest, a missed payment, a penalty, a forced sale. Each step felt survivable. That's how traps work. They don't close fast, they close quietly. By the time people realized the game was rigged, they were already inside it. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The system didn't collapse because people were ignorant. It worked because people were reasonable. They adapted. They adjusted. They did what made sense in the moment. That's why saying people should have resisted misses the point. Resistance costs energy. Hunger removes energy. When every decision is about survival, long-term rebellion disappears. Rome understood this deeply. Keep people busy. Keep them tired. Keep them indebted. They won't revolt. They'll negotiate with their own limits. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Rome. Because once a system learns it can convert control into habit, it never goes back. You don't need chains anymore. You don't need violence anymore. You just need incentives. People will wake up every day and reinforce the system themselves. And when someone points out the trap, they'll sound crazy because the system feels normal. And that's when it's strongest. By the time most people noticed something was wrong, it was already irreversible. Not because Rome was invincible, but because the damage was spread out. No single law ruined lives. No single tax caused collapse. No single decision felt fatal. That's why people accepted it. Each step looked temporary. Each burden felt manageable. Each loss felt like bad luck. Until one day, survival itself became the job. And here's the brutal part. The system didn't fail people. It did exactly what it was designed to do. Extract, stabilize, repeat. Rome didn't want thriving citizens. It wanted predictable ones. Farmers who planted because they had to. Workers who labored because they owed. Families who obeyed because resistance was too expensive. And when cracks appeared, Rome responded carefully. Not with relief, with control. Taxes were adjusted. Rules were reformed. New policies promised fairness. But the structure stayed the same. That's how systems survive pressure. They changed the surface, not the core. People blamed corruption. They blamed greedy officials. They blamed bad harvests. Few blamed the model itself. Because attacking the system meant questioning everything you depended on: money, law, order. And most people don't want chaos. They want stability, even if it's unfair. This is where the real tragedy sits. The system trained people to fear collapse more than exploitation. So when inequality widened, they endured it. When debt grew, they adapted. When land disappeared, they worked harder, and the wealth gap expanded quietly. Large estates grew larger, small farmers vanished, power centralized. By the time revolts happened, they were desperate, uncoordinated, easy to crush. Rome didn't fall because of the poor rising up. It lasted centuries after this system was in place, because once dependency locks in, time works for the system, not against it. And here's the part most people miss. This wasn't ancient ignorance. It was modern logic, efficiency, standardization, predictability. Rome optimized society the way a business optimizes cost. Humans became units, land became yield, debt became leverage, and it worked. So when people ask, why didn't they stop it? They're asking the wrong question. The right question is, at what point does survival replace freedom so completely that people stop noticing the difference? Because once that happens, escape doesn't require guards. It requires awareness. And awareness is the last thing a system like this allows to spread freely. Here's the uncomfortable truth most people don't want to hear. This system didn't disappear with Rome. It didn't die with empires. It didn't end with history books. It evolved. The tools changed. The language changed. The packaging got cleaner. But the logic stayed the same. Centralize control, create dependency, normalize the cost. And just like before, it never announces itself. It starts as convenience, then becomes necessity, then becomes invisible. You don't notice the shift when it happens slowly. A little more debt here, a little less ownership there. A few more rules. For stability, nothing dramatic, nothing that feels like a breaking point. Until one day, you realize your choices have narrowed. You work to service obligations. You earn to keep access. You comply to avoid falling behind. And just like in ancient times, most people don't rebel. They adjust. Because rebellion risks everything. And the system makes sure you always have something to lose. That's the genius of it. Not force, not fear. Pressure. Slow, constant pressure. The kind that makes people blame themselves instead of the structure. If I just work harder. If I just budget better. If I just play by the rules. Meanwhile, the rules keep moving. This is why studying old systems matters. Not because history repeats perfectly, but because human behavior doesn't change. People accept what feels normal. They defend what they depend on, and they ignore what changes slowly. Rome didn't fall when this system began. It thrived because of it. That should scare you a little, because systems like this don't collapse quickly. They last a long time. They adapt. They survive criticism. And they only break when the pressure finally exceeds what people can carry. The warning signs aren't riots. They're silence. When people stop asking questions. When survival becomes routine. When dependency feels like order. That's when the system is strongest. So, no, this isn't about the past. It's about recognizing patterns before they finish locking in. Because once a system lives inside your habits, inside your expectations, inside your definition of normal, leaving it becomes almost impossible. Not because you're trapped, but because you've been trained not to see the door. If this video helped you understand the pattern more clearly, hit like. It tells the algorithm this kind of content matters. And subscribe if you want more videos that break down how power, money, and systems really work. Because once you see the pattern, you can't unsee it.